Everyone. Today we're here for the Stock Sense Exclusion Fencing webinar. A bit about Stock Sense. So we're funded by the Victorian Farmer, we're funded by the Cattle Compensation Fund and the Sheep and Goat Compensation Fund, and we're delivered by the VFS Livestock Group. Stock Sense was established to help Victorian livestock producers maintain and improve animal health, welfare, as well as Victoria's overall biosecurity status. We do this through numerous different ways. We run educational workshops, webinars, and we develop fact sheets and distribute of related industry material through social media and e-newsletters. We have a few upcoming events everyone might be interested in. On the 16th of November, we have a fencing and biosecurity workshop in Ballerine. On the 18th of November, we have a stock handling and yard design workshop in Numurkah. That's also a collaboration with Dairy Australia and Murray Dairy. On the 21st of November, we have a Goat Essentials workshop in Wattle Flat. On the 28th of November, we have a fencing and biosecurity workshop in Mansfield. A bit about tonight. Jarrod will discuss the planning and design of exclusion fencing through to ongoing management. He'll also cover how fencing fits into integrated control of declared pest species and the ethical management of wildlife. That runs for about 40 minutes. And then Jack, who is from Gallagher Territory Manager, he will showcase Gallagher product options to best support fencing needs and enhance on-farm efficiency. So Jarrod runs a paddock to plate in Central Victoria and brings extensive experience from roles across state departments, including DECA and AgVic. He has been involved in running rabbit control programs, including the release of the Cleese virus, and has led the construction of exclusion fencing through government programs to support grazing management and grazing exclusion. So Jack from Gallagher has a strong experience in territory management and business development, working across agriculture and supporting farmers through practical, innovative solutions to improve productivity and profitability. Tonight, Jack will run through Gallagher's product options and share insights to help farmers improve their systems. Bit of housekeeping. So at the end, we'll have a Q&A. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, just type it into the box and we'll get to them at the end. So the presentation will be for an hour, 40 minutes from Jack, 40 minutes from Jarrod and 20 minutes from Jack. And then we'll have 30 minutes of questions at the end. Slides will be sent via email at the end. So feel free to flick through them at the end. The video will also be on YouTube, so subscribe on YouTube if you want to rewatch the full video. Also, we'll send out a survey at the end of the webinar, so it will just help us improve these webinars in the future. So if you could please do that, it will greatly help us. You can stay in contact with us. We're on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube, and our email's there. And you can also visit our website. All right, well, I'll pass over to Jarrod, and he'll run you through his presentation.
No worries. Good evening, everybody. We'll just get this set up and rocking and rolling. Hopefully everybody can see that. Yep, great. All right, welcome. I'm hoping tonight to get you through a fair bit of information, and some of it's detailed and some of it's sort of big picture. The detailed stuff, as Jack was saying in the introduction there, we'll share the slides with you later, and there's some stuff in there about costs and designs and stuff. So sort of don't panic, sit back, relax, get a feel for exclusion fencing and what's possible and what might benefit you, and then we'll dive into the detail towards the end of the slides, and we'll share those slides with you later on as well. So certainly we'll have some questions later on. Feel free to ask those at the end of the presentation. I've just flicked up a few photos here from the farm. You can see the fox walking through the fence. There's supposed to be a rabbit in the left-hand corner. There's a wallaby or a kangaroo in the right-hand corner. So we're in Central Vic. We're plagued, like everybody here on this presentation, I suppose, with some form of pest, whether it be native or non-native. And we try to manage those species so they to reduce the impact on our farm. We've had some wins, but we've also had some problems, and I'll share some of those with you as we go along, and you're welcome to ask questions towards the end. As Jack was saying in the intro there, I've built quite a number of fences through government programs and for Park Vic, those sorts of people, for vegetation monitoring, so in national parks, but also on farms to exclude kangaroos in particular from revegetation plots, for example. So not all of that was successful. Some of it wasn't. There's certainly been a lot of learning that's gone on in this sector, if you like, for probably 20 years. So going back 20 years, exclusion fencing was pretty difficult. We didn't really know what we were doing. There was some sloping fence designs that were built and trialed, and there was a lot of trial and error. But I think we've got to the stage now where we have pretty good designs for single species or a couple of species, and we've got quite good designs for multiple species, and they're at a cost point now that makes sense. So that's where we're at in terms of the big picture. If you're going to build something, you really need to think about why you might do that. So, what's the aim of this exclusion fence for your property? And you've probably already done a bit of thinking about this, but you really need to clarify that thinking around the species. All is not best. So, for example, we target foxes and we target kangaroos. We don't worry about the rabbits. We manage them in other ways because the cost of adding rabbits to the exclusion fence is prohibitive for us. So most people only have one, maybe two species that they're concerned about, but and they'll be able to design a fence that suits their needs. So try to avoid the temptation of going, oh, I don't want anything on my farm. I want to get rid of everything. I don't want any pests. That's probably not practical, or if it is, it's very expensive. So, but it is cost effective to exclude one or two species at a time. Jack from Gallagher will talk about some of the products they have later on, and it's certainly possible to strengthen fences with their products or electricity, and it's certainly possible to add strength to fences later on or deterrent to fences later on. So you're not locked in, but the early decisions that you make will shape, I suppose, the type of fence that you're going to wind up and the species you can keep out at a later stage. If you were to add rabbits, for example, that's a fairly simple retrofit, but it is more efficient, more cost efficient, and more time efficient to build that in at the beginning. So think about the aim. What are you trying to achieve? What are you trying to achieve? What's the big picture you're trying to achieve? There's some good reasons to do this work. None of this will surprise you. For us, it was about damage control, damage to pasture, damage to fences. We've certainly built a number of these fences in the past for revegetation, particularly around rabbits, but also macropods, so kangaroos and wallabies. Pasture establishment and management, so too much grazing will impact the volume of pasture, but it also impacts the species mix that you wind up with. So if you've got too many people, too many animals eating your pasture, then all the lollies get eaten, and the dry biscuits get left behind. So managing that pasture utilisation is important and becoming more and more important in farming. And if you don't control the grazing, then you don't really control the pasture utilisation, and therefore you don't control the species in that pasture either. So livestock protection is vital, of course. None of us want to see our livestock mauled, maimed or injured. And lastly, I'd say peace of mind. I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through, but peace of mind is of great value. And at some point when you're making a value judgment about your fence and the cost of your fence, that peace of mind might come into that. Now, biosecurity is also really important for all of us now, and will become more important. I mean, just to our north, we've got neighbours there with lumpy skin disease, foot and mouth disease, and those sorts of things. Locally, though, we've got a whole range of diseases. Unfortunately, one of our neighbours has Yonis, so we try to double fence our place, and we do that by running plantations around the boundary. But the exclusion fences are even better. You know, they by nature, by definition, exclude other people's grazing animals much better than our old fences. Our old fences were pretty ordinary, and we would have livestock breaches. Mine would get out, others would get in, and that could lead to big problems. So having exclusion fences on part of our boundaries has been fantastic from that biosecurity point of view. It gives us peace of mind around biosecurity, but also gives us peace of mind around our grazing management. Design and cost. So these two ideas are interrelated. The design needs to be sufficient to deter most or all of the animals, and the cost needs to be such that it is practical to do so. I'll talk a bit more about that in the next slide, but every aspect of design comes at some financial cost. So I like the KISS method, keep it simple, stupid, and I like simpler fences and fences that are fairly robust and don't take a lot of maintenance. But for some exclusion fences, you definitely need electrification, and that adds another layer or another effort of management. You need to maintain that electrification. We had free-range pigs here for about 10 years, and we spent a lot of time going around electric fences, so we understand the cost of those, I suppose, both in their initial build and their ongoing maintenance. But most exclusion fences, you can read the text there, are typically constructed using wire or mesh or netting, often electrified for added deterrence. Height ranges 1.5 to 2.5 metres, depending on the target species. Buried skirts or angled overhangs deter digging and climbing. So buried skirts aren't essential. And when we say buried, we mean skirts that lay on the ground and become buried over time by themselves. You don't need to dig a hole and bury the skirt. For the species that we're talking about in Victoria, they're not, they don't dig enough to warrant that sort of effort. So costs vary wildly. So, I put $5,000 to $15,000 a kilometre there, but those fences that exclude feral cats and foxes to a high degree cost north of $20,000 a kilometre. So terrain and materials and contractors availability all factor into the cost as well. Maintenance and monitoring add to the long-term costs, but ensure continued effectiveness. So we need to check these fences and run around them. Our experience so far has been that I'd have to say that the exclusion fence has needed a little bit more maintenance than our internal fences of the same age, but the exclusion fence receives a lot more pressure, a lot more pressure, and I'll share that fence with you later in the presentation. So this is just a bit of an example of how you might go about or how you might think about fencing. The temptation again is to go, oh, I want a Rolls Royce and I want it right around my property. So we've started, with a base model vehicle here or a base model fence, and we've added to it as we've learnt and understood. So we've fenced our eastern boundary on the right-hand side of the diagram here, and we've fenced our northern boundary at the top of the page and our southern boundary at the bottom of the page. You can see that we back onto Crown land and forest, so we're heavily impacted by species that we don't want on our farm, so we've elected to choose or protect those boundaries, if you like. We still get incursions, but they're manageable with that current arrangement. So I guess coming into this presentation, you might think you need to build a boundary fence right around your farm. That's not necessarily the case. You might build an exclusion fence around your free-range chook paddock, your lambing paddock, your back boundary if it's wild dogs, whatever the case may be. You don't necessarily need an enclosed system, but for some species, you will. So if you're trying to exclude foxes, you'll need some sort of enclosed system. If you're trying to exclude goats, then you might get away, depending on the landscape, with an open system. It really just depends. It really depends on your terrain. And I'm really just talking about the Victorian context here. So obviously, if you're going to fence for goats in New South Wales, you need an enclosed system. We're not going to touch too much on pigs, but there's not a lot of feral pigs in Victoria at the moment, thank goodness. But I think we might have a slide on pigs, or we might not. But happy to take questions on pigs if they're an issue for people. I just wanted you to think about how you might design this thing rather than jumping to perhaps a more natural conclusion, or I need to do all my boundary. I'm happy to talk later or answer questions later about how that open design works at our place. This is what a typical exclusion fence looks like. This one's local again. This one's very, very typical of the sorts of fences that I'm seeing locally now. We've got several in our road and numerous dozens within our area. We're in central Victoria. So most of these are for macropods. Some have additional rabbit proofing, or perhaps now is a good time to talk about rabbit fences, but I'm yet to see a rabbit fence that is only has rabbits on one side of it. I'm sure there must be some out there, but my 30 years as in this game around rabbits, I've yet to see one. So rabbit fences require a hell of a lot of maintenance and an almost pathological hatred of rabbits and a pathological desire to maintain that fence. So I'd urge you to think long and hard about a so-called rabbit-proof fence. Australia doesn't have a very good history when it comes to rabbit-proof fences. We've got a lot of rabbit-resistant fences, but not too many rabbit-proof fences. So I think just, if you're going to have a rose garden or something, great. That's something you might be able to maintain. I live in an extremely rabbit-prone area, and even those house yard fences are always breached. As I say, I'm yet to see a rabbit-proof fence. So typical exclusion fences around here are this sort of 1.8 metre high fences with steel posts and wooden end assemblies. I'll show you those in a moment. And usually some sort of prefabricated wire netting. It's not chicken wire netting, it's not rabbit netting, it's hinge joint or ring lock or one of those sort of fences. And one little button. Oh, there we go. Fox and feral cats. So I'll show you a slide on these, but I'm not sure if there's people in the audience that want to exclude foxes and feral cats. If you've got free-range chickens, you might be interested in fox exclusion, and that's practical now in terms of cost. Feral cats, perhaps a little bit more difficult, but both can be excluded with the following sort of fence design. So again, don't worry about this. We'll provide the slides later in some detail, and I'll provide a link to the source of this information, which is a government report. So even this data here is probably 10 years old now, but it's probably still current. So that evolution of fencing that I've talked about, or evolution of exclusion fencing that I talked about earlier, has reached not a pinnacle, but we've reached a point where we know what we're doing. We're reasonably confident about what works, and this will work for foxes and cats. There's lots of versions out there, but this is a pretty robust version, and it comes from the Arid Lands Recovery Project, which is where they release bilbies and bettongs and things like that into the desert. So they really need virtual high levels of fox and cat deterrent. there's no such thing as a proof fence. You know, I mean, feral proof fence is only feral proof for the day that there's no ferals in there, and eventually something will happen and that fence will be breached. So unfortunately, all of these native animal enclosures suffer breaches some from time to time. Not all, you know, not all of them do, but many of them do, and that can be malice, where people cut a hole in the fence. It can be nature, where perhaps a tree falls on that fence, or a windstorm or something like that takes out a section of fence, or a wombat comes along and digs a hole under the fence or whatever. So even the best fences, and this is arguably some of the best fences, require maintenance, that surveillance and maintenance. So we'll come back to this for those that are interested in the question section about some of the detail and what the costs involved are. This is a typical rabbit fence. Same sort of thing. There's nothing terribly exciting about this, but some of you might notice that they're advocating 30mm mesh at the bottom there. That's to exclude young rabbits. So the 40mm mesh size or opening size is much more common, and young rabbits will breach that easily. So if you want to do the job properly, you need the smaller mesh size on the bottom. Of course, it's a little bit more expensive. You don't need the additional height. That's only there if you want to exclude stock. But and again, if the rabbits get into plague proportions, they'll climb these fences, but that's unlikely. What have we got here? We've got a goat fence. For those that want to keep goats or exclude goats, this fence will do both. So again, it's a prefabricated mesh fence with the addition of a barbed wire at the bottom and perhaps some barbed wires at the top. Height is important for goats, at least 1500 high for goats. They will go over lower fences, old lower sheep fences with 6-line on them or something like that. So this has got an 8-line fence on it, 8 horizontal lines. So for those sort of familiar with fencing and farming a bit more, there's the 8, 90, 30. So that's 8 horizontal lines, 90 centimetres high and 30 centimetres between those vertical pickets. That's the sort of mesh you want for goats. Pigs definitely need electrification. Pigs will just push under and bulldoze their way through anything else. They don't need a lot of electrification. I mean, they don't need a lot of wires, electric wires, but they will need at least one. In my view, I think this is perhaps a little bit light, and I'd be adding a second electric wire to this design. But we had pigs in confinement, so I guess they're under more pressure. But that electrification and that maintenance of that high voltage is really important if we're to deter pigs from pushing through that fence, because the strength of the fence is nowhere near sufficient to stop larger pigs pushing their way through. You must have electricity to stop them. Here's a bit of a closer shot of you know, an exclusion fence. This one's built for kangaroos. Again, this is a local fence. You can sort of see the terrain and habitat that might be typical around Victoria. So this fence is reasonably cheap to build, and is probably something that might be a benefit to you. This fence looks to be made from 2 layers of 890 15 by the looks of it. What I really wanted to talk a bit about here was the end assembly, which is the pine posts, so the 2 vertical pine posts and the horizontal stay. It's really important not to skimp on the end assemblies in any fence, and that they need to be supersized if you're going to build a supersized fence. So if you're going to double the height of the fence, you sort of need to double the end assembly. So obviously you need to double the height, but I would like to see that stay even longer. the reasons I won't go into now, but the geometry of the end assembly only works if those relationships are maintained. So if the posts are going to be twice as high, you really should make that stay more than 1 times normal length, if that makes sense. So ideally to be double the length, but that gets a bit impractical. This is only about 1.2 times normal length. It really should be around 1.5 times normal length at least, so closer to 4 metres than 3. We've got a gate that's been retrofitted on this fence here. People are going to ask about gates and what they can do. Whatever you want to do is the answer. We've done things like this, where we've welded some uprights onto it and a piece of scrap pipe and things like that. They work fine. I don't think you can buy gates that do this, and if you do, they're going to be pretty expensive. So there's not a lot of pressure on gates. Animals don't know that there's a gate there necessarily, especially wildlife. So they don't put any extra pressure on a gate that they wouldn't put on the fence. The only extra pressure you might see is because you're in a corner of a paddock, and if animals are driven or scared or frightened, they'll wind up in the corner of the paddock and they might put some extra pressure on that gate. But look, we found that sort of light welded retrofitting works quite well. I think the next slide shows you some more retrofitting. This is pretty agricultural, but pretty typical of farmers. We've done some similar stuff here. So they've extended their wooden posts. They've also extended their steel posts, as you can see a little bit further down the line there. This is a labour intensive way of doing it, but if you've got an existing fence that's in good condition, then retrofitting or adding an extra layer to that fence to increase to double the height is quite sensible and practical. How you go about it doesn't really matter. It doesn't need to be that strong. We'll come to that a little bit later on. This is an unsuccessful retrofit. So this is something I did early on. This is barbed wire on top of a crappy old government fence. There's 100-year-old wire netting on the bottom of this fence, and one of our early frustrating efforts at managing kangaroo incursion was to add this layer of barbed wire. Many farmers around here have added plain wires, typically 10 to 15 centimetres apart, and barbed wire. Both are unsuccessful. Both allow too many kangaroos through those fences. So even the barbed wire doesn't seem to deter them. They'll come through that fence to graze in our paddocks. They will also go through those fences if alarmed. So I wouldn't encourage you to go that way. It's very cheap, but it's not really sufficient. And yeah, I can't think of a good scenario where you might run this sort of fence. I think in nearly all cases, you'd be better off doing the job properly. We'll look at cost further down the track though. Well, actually, next slide. So cost, this is what I'm sure you're dying to know about. This was something that is hard to find. It's not out there. But fence materials are roughly 50% of the cost. Labour to build the fence is roughly 50%. I'm assuming most of you here tonight are thinking about building your own fences, but that's sort of the ballpark. It gives you an idea of the effort as well. So fences that are normal stock fences, this rule's roughly right as well. It depends on the length and the fence design and the materials, but they're roughly, you might stray 10 or 15% either side of 50%, but that's a ballpark guide for those here tonight. Quality materials are essential. So I tell people in our fencing courses, you're not buying the wire, you're buying the galvanizing. So cheap wire has cheap galvanizing on it, and that galvanizing will deteriorate rapidly, and therefore the fence will deteriorate rapidly. The other problem with cheap materials or inferior quality materials is that they are easily damaged by those pest species. Not so much foxes, of course, but anything with a bit of weight behind it. So pigs, goats, cattle, sheep, kangaroos, wallabies, wombats. Those animals easily damage those or stretch those cheaper materials. Simpler designs are the cheapest. So again, coming back to that KISS method, keeping it simple, stupid is easiest. It's quicker and easier to build, and it's cheaper in materials. Adding electric wires adds deterrence, but it does add maintenance, as we talked about earlier. So that maintenance stuff is unavoidable for some species, but for others it is easily avoidable. So some people tried and still do run electric wires for kangaroos, for example. I think that would be a lot of maintenance in most cases, and perhaps not the best use of my time. Others may disagree, and that's entirely okay. And then, as I talked about earlier, what value is peace of mind? And I wanted to give you a bit of an example here. We ran free-range ducks for a few years, and we ran them out in a converted garage that was we towed around the paddock. So this was a shed, a large shed that we towed around the paddock with a tractor. The ducks were very messy. As you'd imagine, they were confined in that shed overnight, and they'd free range during the day. But overnight, they would do what ducks do, and they had plenty of water in there, so they made a hell of a mess, and we'd move that shed every second day. So when the wind got up, the shed would blow over. So about 50 k's an hour was about our limit. 60 or 70 k's an hour and the shed would go over, and we'd lose some ducks sometimes, or we'd have to put the shed back together. So I found it very difficult, even after we got out of ducks. If it was a windy night, I found it very difficult to sleep because I was worried about that shed rolling over. I was talking to a bloke the other day, I was listening to a bloke on a podcast or something. He was a sheep farmer in the northeast of Victoria, and he'd been there a while, and the wild dogs were giving him a bit of grief, as you'd imagine. So they bit the bullet and electrified their boundary fence, and they had no dogs on the property after that. They had a bushfire come through, and within 3 days, the dogs were back killing his sheep again. He said the same sort of thing. He said, look, I couldn't sleep, so we electrified the boundary again. So peace of mind is important, and peace of mind is not just about maiming and the loss of livestock. It's about being able to grow grass, being able to sustainably manage your farm and improve your farm. For us, we couldn't grow grass at the back of our property, and the Crown land behind us it doesn't grow grass. So the kangaroo pressure was intense, and we needed to manage that for peace of mind. And think about some of those things, and think about what value you place on that. There's a bit of an example around what fencing might cost and what benefits you might gain. I did this scenario. I'm not sure how relevant it is, but I picked a sort of a 40-acre example or a 16-hectare example, which requires 1.6 kilometres of fencing. I did some pine end assemblies there for about $700 odd. A gate, I chose $300. You'd probably go and buy a 14, 16-foot gate and retrofit it for that. Some wire and gripples or wire joiners, strainers. So we're looking at about $8,900 plus labour. So labour varies dramatically from region to region and based on terrain. So I really didn't want to include labour in an example. But just for materials, we're looking at about $560 a hectare, which for me, I picked a 5-year payback period. I thought that was sort of reasonable. Turns out to about $111 per hectare per year. So that fence has either cost me or saved me $111 per hectare for 5 years. After 5 years, I paid for the fence, and I continue to get benefit from that fence. In fact, the life of the fence, because it's an exclusion fence and it has got a lot of pressure on it, I still should get 20 years out of that fence. An ordinary fence, we might get 30 to 40 years out of it. But if I got 20 years out of that, 30 years, I'd be really happy. So for us, at $111 a hectare, if that was our cost, for example, then if I had to pay that $111 a hectare for 5 years to have better grass for 5 years and for the next 15 or 20 years, I think I'd be pretty happy with that. But everybody's got to make their own judgment around that. So if you've got free-range poultry, this might be a no-brainer for you. If you've got horticulture, this might be a no-brainer for you. If you're growing grass like us, then the maths are important, because making money out of farming is difficult, unless you know something I don't. How to manage incursions. So this is where unwanted species get back on your farm, and this is going to happen. There's absolutely no way this won't happen. This is a given. We're all going to have to manage pests going into the future. You can't exclude them completely, and there is that ongoing maintenance. So start with a high quality, well-designed fence. Doesn't need to be rocket science, just needs to be following best practice, and we'll share that with you further down the presentation. Our management strategies do include these things. We regularly inspect. I'm not paranoid about this, but I go and check my fence once a month, every 6 weeks, depending on what's going on. At the moment, there's plenty of feed around. I can leave it 6 months. But identifying breaches early is good. Don't let the animals, the pest animals, get into the habit of going under or through your fence, because it's very, very difficult to stop them doing that. Our early strategy was to, and I guess you might be in the same place as me, you might be at the point where you've got animals coming onto your property and you don't want them to come on your property, so you're basically plugging one hole and then they go and find another hole to breach, and you plug that, they find another one, you plug that, you know how the rope, that goes. So a good fence in the beginning with swift action on breaches is important. There are a heap of remote monitoring systems out there. You can use wildlife cameras at the simple end of the spectrum, security cameras, Wi-Fi to your house. You can use a whole range of sensors that plug into electric fences to let you know about the voltage in those fences. So there's a whole lot of things you can do there if you want to, and that'll depend on how long your system is and how remote it is and how far away you need to travel to check your fences. Trapping, shooting or baiting to remove animals that breach those fences are important. I think the effect of trapping, shooting and baiting is effectively harassment. So you want to make those animals feel unwelcome on your farm, and to do that quickly, and to educate those animals quickly. So the fox you see today moving through the paddock is going to be the same fox you'll see next week and the week after, and etc., etc. So if it knows you're no threat, it's going to get bolder and bolder and bolder until it kills your chooks. So the way to deter those animals is to, when you see those animals, deal with those animals quickly. Coordinated community efforts at a landscape scale help, but they're difficult to get going and they're very, very difficult to maintain. So I'm talking about community baiting programs for wild dogs, rabbits, foxes, that sort of thing, but they need to be at scale, 3 or 4 properties. We once did a project on 6,500 acres, and we could not, a baiting program and a shooting program, I think it was, and we couldn't achieve a significant reduction in foxes in the middle of that property. And it was rectangular shaped, but the foxes just infiltrated almost as quickly as we could remove them. So there was less foxes in the landscape on that property, and there was less lamb losses, but there was still a fox problem, and that was at 6,500 acres. So we really need to deal with those incursions quickly, and that's about discipline, really. So look, it's an effective tool. It's not going to solve all your problems, but it does offer a measure of comfort and control over those pest problems. And we've certainly had quite a lot of benefit from our fences, and even running through this presentation and these exercises, those cost benefit exercises, it encouraged me to do a little bit more. I can see the benefit of those fences. We had a neighbour come here at one stage to look at the fence I'd just built, and I couldn't believe how much grass we had. And he's a neighbour 3 kilometres down the road in the same position, in the same landscape as us, with the same pest problem as us. And we have grass while they have dirt. So it certainly works. The benefits are long term. There's benefits for biodiversity conservation, agriculture. And at this stage, I'd say that the benefits in nearly all situations outweigh the costs. Talked a little bit about some additional resources, and again, we'll share these slides with you. The top link is around financial support for farmers to manage kangaroos. This is a grant program through Agriculture Victoria. Being a government grant, there's 2 or 3 conditions needed for qualification. Happy to talk about that in the questions section if we get questions. And the second link there is the diagrams around those fences that I showed you earlier. So there's a report there that contains those diagrams with the goat fences and the rabbit fences and those sorts of fences. There's some old costings in those reports too. I think I might have updated those. But yeah, that report's probably well worth a look further down the track before you build. I was going to, I thought we might be doing questions here, but we're not. We'll do them later. This is just a bit of a slide around some material costs. And again, I could share this, probably this entire spreadsheet with you at some stage, just to give you an idea about comparing fencing options, I suppose. And to that end, I wanted to make a point here. I see a lot of fences built out of what I call deer mesh, which is prefabricated fencing. This one's 183 centimetres tall, so 1.8 metres tall. The wire only for that fence, so this is no posts, no poles, no gripples, no nothing. The wire only is around $8,300 a kilometre. Now, a kilometre doesn't sound, well, sounds like a lot, I think, but it's once you start measuring your boundary, it's yeah, it quickly adds up. Whereas 2 lots of 80, 90, 15 are only $4,800 per kilometre. So that's a double height fence. The same height fence is $4,800 a kilometre versus $8,300 a kilometre. Very, very similar fence. There's a little bit more wire in the, well, there's one wire extra in the deer mesh, and perhaps it's a bit stronger, but gee, that's a lot of difference. That's, you know, nearly double, approaching double. So the 2 heights of normal fencing wire are nice and easy to build, and I'd strongly encourage you to look at that option as one of many options that you might look at. All right, well, that's sort of my time. I might hand over to Jack from Gallagher, and he might have a bit of chat to you about their products.
Thank you, Jarrod. We'll see if we can get that all working. Perfect. Well, I'll just do a quick introduction to myself before I get stuck into it. Like Jack mentioned, I've been a territory manager with Gallagher for the last 4 years throughout Western Victoria. And throughout that time, have been involved a number of times dealing with predominantly primary producers, a number of different groups, land care, the likes, community groups and farming groups in regards to electric fencing. I'll just go through today. What I'm looking to cover is just a bit about who we are, Gallagher, touch on electric fencing and why we do electric fencing, and then a couple of key products that are sort of relevant to exclusion fencing. So I'll just run this video if it works.
When we invented the electric fence in the 1930s, our story of innovation has just begun.
So Gallagher as a company started quite some time ago, as mentioned in that video there. William Gallagher, he had a pesky horse out on farm, as a farmer himself, that kept rubbing up on his car. So Joe the horse continued to damage the fenders of his car, knock the mirrors off, causing a whole heap of problems. So being the sort of innovator that he is, he essentially jerry-rigged a battery, an elastic band around an alternator to electrify the car. So one day he, came back. The horse was a long way away from the vehicle and didn't want to interact with it again. And that there was essentially the beginning of electric fencing. Obviously, a lot safer these days in regards to the battery and current that was being sent through that poor horse. But since then, we've been doing electric fencing for over 85 years. It's a New Zealand-based company, still family-owned. William's son, Sir William, heads up the company still and is based around the world. So from a small town based in Hamilton, where 90% of the product is still manufactured and supplied out of there. So we'll just jump straight into it in terms of how electric fencing works. So essentially, the idea of electric fencing is focused around creating a short, sharp, but harmless pulse to contain livestock. So what this does is it actually creates a psychological barrier opposed to just a physical one. So like in this image here, exactly you'll see that the cows are respecting what is a small piece of tape, which has been electrified. A couple of reasons why you might look at instigating or utilising electric fencing and why you might look at using it. It's often a lot quicker and easier to construct than your conventional or traditional style fencing. It is also creating that psychological barrier to stop the animals re-interacting with that boundary. It's harmless, so devoid of things like barbed wire that might cause damage or scar that you may have to treat on your own livestock. Generally cheaper to construct than conventional fencing, and it's effective on all animals. So we've got energizers all around the world. We sell to more than 160 countries globally, and energizers are used on a whole range of different animals. There's villages in Namibia that are keeping out elephants, lions, tigers, buffalo throughout America, all different sorts of animals that are being kept out with the utilization of electric fence. Essentially, also what it does do is it allows you the ability to improve your grazing management system as well. So it's not just that exclusion piece, but you can actually utilize that in terms of rotational grazing, improve pasture and the likes. It's important to remember for the likes of when kangaroos are inside eating your grass, generally one kangaroo is equivalent to one DSE or one dry sheep equivalent. So anytime you see, 1, 2, 20 kangaroos in the paddock, it's essentially eating the same as having a sheep in there. A bit of a background and a key thing to note, not just for exclusion fencing, but any electric fencing, we actually find that around 80 or 90% of issues with electric fencing generally comes down to poor earthing. So the way that earthing works, there's two essential ways that it works. We've got what we call an all live system, which you might see up here on the top right hand side. What that is essentially consists of an energizer, earth stakes, and then the fence being live itself. For the animal to get a pulse, essentially what it does is it will push against the wire, and that connection and circuit will be closed through the soil itself back to the earth terminal on the energizer. This works particularly well with large animals with strong footprints. Where a 300 kilo cow with 4 feet is well planted onto the ground in terms of that connection through the soil. Where it might be challenging is particularly in Australia, where we've got variable soil types, clay, rock, likes, and the etc., or alternative animals. There is also what we call an earth return system. So what that is like in the diagram below, you'll have a hot wire, which runs from the energizer terminal out onto the fence, and then what we call an earth return wire, which will run throughout the fence system and back through the stakes directly to the unit. Where this is beneficial is along the lines of animals like kangaroos, in terms of they've got very small footprint, a lot lighter footed than something like a cow. And when the animal touches both of those wires, it'll make a much cleaner circuit back through, and so a much more memorable shock for the animal itself. I've got it here, which I'll just touch on briefly. So if you are doing any other sorts of electric fencing, this is probably a number one thing to remember. Essentially, you can never have too much earth, but what we suggest in terms of our earthing system, we suggest a minimum of 3 earth stakes 4 meters apart. If you can drive the stakes 2 meters into the ground, do it where possible. A lot of the time people will use shelf stakes, so you get it as far into the ground as possible, and then having one wire connecting back to the terminal of the energizer. With larger energizers, there's a bit more of a rule of thumb around for every 10 joules in your energizer, we want at least 2 earth stakes. So it sounds like a lot, but it does, it makes the system significantly more effective. An alternative to galvanized posts, we do sell what we call a super earth kit, which is made up of a salt and bentonite sort of clay mix, which essentially, once wetted and put into the soil, will increase the earthing field, so equivalent of about 3 standard earth stakes. Here we have just a bit of an example of the difference of when a fence is electrified opposed to not electrified. The reason for this comes down to the induction or the electromagnetic field, which animals learn to respect. This field actually can come away from the fence. So as you're looking in the right-hand side there's a fence tester which is picking up voltage even though not making contact with the wire. Animals you might see, the smarter the animal, the more effective electric fencing is. You might see the likes of horses, cattle that look like they're sniffing a fence. What they're actually doing is often sensing to see if there is that field of energy, whether the fence is active or not. When talking about energizers, there is a couple of different solutions based on your power supply or lack thereof. So we have multi-powered energizers, which can be set up with solar systems and external batteries. We also have portable solar energizers, which are a complete closed-in unit that has the energizer, the solar panel, and can be moved around. Often used more in terms of strip gazing and covering smaller temporary fences. And we also then have battery-powered energizers that are running just off batteries. What I'll cover through here is one of our, I guess, feature energizers, which is generally used for larger blocks, and also gives you the ability to monitor the fence, which when looking at an exclusion fence becomes very, very important. So this is what we call our I-series energizer system, which we do for energizers that generally are to cover around 100 acres and above. There's a couple of key components around the I-series energizer. It's essentially a smart energizer, and a couple of the key features there is that it has what we call adaptive control. So this means that it has a target voltage on the fence, which you can set, whether it be 9,000 volts, 8,000 volts, or the likes. When that fence comes under pressure, maybe a branch or grass or the likes that is inhibiting the fence and drawing away some of that power, what it does is it kicks in with what we call adaptive control, which is kind of like cruise control on your car. It's got that target voltage that it will push out to make sure that the fence is still within a acceptable range. Obviously, a dead short, you'll need to review and fix. The second key piece around the I-series energizers comes around fence monitoring. So particularly where, you might have an exclusion fence is around a boundary or heavily treed area where you're getting most activity from feral animals, down trees and the likes. What the I-series system can do, it allows you to set up a number of fence monitors on that fence. So essentially what a fence monitor is that you can set that up on a point of the fence or a zone of your fence line. And that's like having somebody standing out there day and night, wet or cold, monitoring that specific part of the fence. So what that does is you can view that back from the unit itself, or you can continue to use your I-series remote or fault finder to help find out exactly where that fault is or that leakage of power is occurring. The I-series remote also has the ability to turn the fence on and off from the remote, which gives you a bit of peace of mind that when you're there and you find a fault, you can turn it off and fix it there right away, and then turn it back on and make sure that the fence is operating as you need, rather than spending time running back and forth, turning it on, getting on the phone to whoever's with you, your partner, back at the house, telling them to turn it on over the phone, and then finding out that it hasn't been turned off. With those zones and monitors setups, what you can do is you can monitor that from the display from the energizer itself, or you can take it one step further. So what we've got here is what we call an app gateway. which will allow you to piggyback off any existing Wi-Fi that you might have. So if your Energizer is near your house or a shed that has Wi-Fi, what you have the ability to do is to send all that information from the Energizer, which travels up to the cloud, and then will talk directly to your mobile phone through our Ag Devices app. So like here on the screen, you can set up to 6 monitors per Energizer, which you can name into being different zones. It could be back paddock, main street, anything that's relevant to you. No matter where you are, as long as your phone has mobile service or you're on the internet around the world, what you can do is you can set your phone to give you notifications in case the voltage drops. And you can also choose to turn on and turn off the Energizer from that unit, which gives you real peace of mind in terms of that the fence is operating as it needs to be. It's quite important in terms of when selecting an Energizer to work with your system that you take into account how much fence you're operating with and then how large the Energizer is. So whether it is our Gallagher system or a competitor or the likes, the important piece is to look at the joules of the Energizer. So that's essentially the engine or the powerhouse behind the Energizer and its ability to push out that pulse. This is just a bit of a breakdown in regards to our I-Series systems, which can run what we call a MBS system, which means they run off mains, battery, and solar. Now getting a bit more specific around exclusion fencing. What we've found over the period of being involved in electric fencing and fencing for quite some time is that a number of animals are highly intelligent, and once they figure out that a fence is not electric powered or of any harm to them, they'll disregard it. One quick way to protect a fence, a pre-existing fence, is to utilize the utilization of what we call offsets, which we've got a photo of on this left-hand side here. So that can be easily put onto an existing fence and utilized to help reinforce an existing system that you do have quickly and easily. Like you'll see here, here's a photo from the Australian Wildlife Conservancy. They've got quite a large mesh fence, likely utilised to keep in a number of smaller animals. And essentially they've added a number of offsets to help electrify and reinforce the strength of that fence. So being in the 21st century that we are, 2025, fencing has changed quite dramatically over the period since poor Joe the horse rubbed up against that car. Like that, all tractors and other sort of things are now connected to the network, cloud-based, tracking themselves. We now have improved our system to what we call a permanent suspension fence. So exclusion fence or inclusion fencing has been part of our history for quite some time. On our left-hand side here is more of a traditional legacy style fence built with mesh and barbed wire, really as a physical barrier. To the right, you'll see what we call a suspension fence, which is designed highly around very monitorable. You can track the fence and performance, and then also creating that mental barrier for the animal. This system here composes of a number of key elements. So essentially very similar to fences that you might be familiar with. What we've got here, what we've added from a Gallagher standpoint, is what we call a eye post, or which is a fully insulated post. So that black post is slightly different to what a traditional dropper is, in the sense that it is pre-threaded with the wire to create, and then strained to create essentially a web or suspension fence, so to speak. This post, or eye post, is made up of a high density polyethylene, which is extruded at a very high temperature. So it's significantly stronger than what you might know or understand in terms of other droppers. This comes in a range of different heights, depending on what sort of animal you are looking to include or exclude. We do it in an 800, 1100, 1300, and 1650. In regards to a bit of a standardized sort of setup that has been used on a number of occasions, this is an example of a 7-wire fence using 4 hot wires. That's around 1100 high. This has been put on a boundary to restrict movement of kangaroos. From there. A couple of the key benefits around suspension fencing is that it's a very competitive investment into your property, and will last for quite a significant period of time. The suspension fence construction is very robust and quite strong, which I'll touch on in a moment. Low maintenance in comparison to some traditional fences in terms of the componentry and ease of repair. It'll safely contain the livestock that you are keeping on inside the fence, whilst eliminating the feral animals outside. It's also environmentally friendly, made up of 90% recycled material into that high density polyethylene. So just a couple of examples of how the fence works. On our left-hand side here, we've got what we call a leaning offset. So what we've got there is one of our 800mm long posts, which you can add to a pre-existing fence. So as you can see there, a much more sort of a traditional style fence, which you can add with multiple hot wires to stop any incursion coming from underneath. As you can see on the inside of the post there's plenty of grass coming through, whereas it's been heavily grazed on the other side. I'll just run you through a couple of examples. So this is another similar fence around 1100 high, with 7 wires and 4 hot wires as well. The other benefit of this sort of system is that it's light and can be fenced essentially anywhere. So being able to get into tough to get places, often where vermin or pests like to incur onto properties, between fence lines, hilly country, is very versatile depending on what sort of landscape you are working. So you can build these fences naturally along the lines of the property. The other key piece around the electrification of a fence, as mentioned earlier, is that a lot of the penetration of a fence comes from underneath the fence, like this in this image here, particularly with the likes of kangaroos, dogs, etc. They like to test the efficacy of a fence and then dig under. So here's another example of our leaning offsets fence, which has been used as part of the South Australia dog fence, which you may or may not be aware has been a long-term challenge for the country. I think originally being set up in around 1885. So this means that you can utilise it on a pre-existing fence and rather than building a brand new fence from that piece. So very cost effective as well. When building a suspension fence, you'll see that there is a bunch of the black eye posts, as I mentioned. The way that it gets built, like I mentioned, is essentially you pull the wire through, strain it up, and then you can push those posts out to spacing as required. So that's an example of how you can do it. You can do that without any dolly. So if you are building a smaller fence, you do have the opportunity to just push that out to the correct spacing, and then they're clipped off just by 2 simple clips to hold them in place. So a couple of key benefits and attributes to the suspension fence include that it is very good in regards to the sense that it is being a suspension fence. The wires don't have to be strained up to maximum tensile. So when they do come under damage or under pressure, that they have the ability to absorb a level of impact. So like if there's a tree down, you'll see that the fence has leant over and is then quite easily reinstated afterwards. So rather than reconnecting a whole range of netting or the likes, it's a number of simple plain wires retied and restrained to re-establish that fence quickly and effectively, so that you can stop any further incursions and get back to what's most valuable to you. Being a high density polyethylene post, they also come back to their original shape, but that they are extruded because it's much stronger than a lot of traditional sort of plastics. One thing to think about when looking at a system such as this comes down to, obviously, cost is a large component, and a large part of the cost comes down often to the amount of steel that's based in the fence. When looking at a traditional legacy fence, an exclusion fence, opposed to a suspension, you'll see that there's quite a significant variation in terms of the volume of steel that goes into that fence. This essentially brings the price down, cost of repairs and ongoing costs of the fence come back quite dramatically. How are we going for time there, Jack?
Yeah, we probably nearly should move on to questions about now. Is there anything quick other thing?
Yeah, no, that's right. I'll just show an example of what we have been doing outside of the traditional sort of farming. We have been doing quite a little bit of work with a number of different groups around what we call a sanctuary fence of the likes, which is essentially a combination of a standard parallel fence with the offset and then also some netting. So this is just an example of a fence that's used at Mount Rothwell, so to protect quolls and rock wallaby population as well. But I'll throw back to you, Jack.
All right, well, that sounds good. We'll get into the question and answers part. So if you have any questions for either Jarrod or Jack, just send them through. We got a few here. So this one's probably for you, Jarrod. So would most fencing contractors be familiar with exclusion fencing, or would you have to kind of find around and look around for someone that's more familiar with it if people are looking to build a fence and get a contractor in?
Yeah, look, really good question. We probably should have covered that. I'd say 10 years ago, most contractors had little to no idea, but I think now contractors are building more and more of these fences where they tend to come unstuck a little bit is with the design. I think probably there's enough information out there for landholders now to probably design their own fence and take a lead from those resources that I shared with you and other sources of information, and design your own fence and then go to a contractor and say, I think this is the way I'd like to build it. I think leaving the design up to the contractor, you're placing a lot of responsibility on the contractor to try and come up with a design that's going to work against those pest animals, and that's perhaps not the best way to approach it. They're good at building fences, but perhaps they need a bit of direction around what you want and what's to be built.
Yeah, that sounds good. So with the difference between electric and barb, would you say that barb's kind of getting phased out a little with exclusion fencing now and it's gonna going towards electric?
Look, absolutely. I think barb's being phased out right across fencing. There's some impacts on wildlife that are not pretty. There's impacts on livestock that are not pretty. It's probably something that we used 100 years ago when we didn't have an alternative, and certainly electricity is 100 times better than barb. It's much more of a deterrent, and barb, we find our cattle scratch on it. So it's of no deterrent. And things like determined wildlife like wombat and kangaroo will quickly become familiar with barb and just run through it or run under it. Or yeah, look, barb was in some of those drawings I shared with you, but that data's from 10 years ago. So where you've got barb in those drawings, I'd probably switch that out for electricity these days.
Yeah, that sounds good. Maybe towards you, Jack. You mentioned a bit of suspension fencing. We got a question. How does the suspension fence go with roos just pushing through, even if it's electrified, compared to a normal hot fence with solid posts every 4 meters?
Yeah, so that's essentially it. With the being electrified, they won't push through. With kangaroos, if you do put them under pressure, so if you're chasing a mob and they're scared and frightened, and they're going to run into the fence, that naturally that can happen. A bit of the benefit is that it's either going to break the fence in the case where it's sort of a more traditional firm fence. Where a suspension fence is beneficial is that it will absorb a lot of that pressure, and you might have 1 or 2 of the animals come through out of a larger mob without completely damaging or ruining the fence in that case, so that you can then re-establish it and set it up appropriately.
Yeah.
The answer's sort of in the name, isn't it, Jack? In that, the wire these days is, look, it's that good, the wire these days, that it will take an enormous impact load. And most modern fencing, in fact, all decent modern fencing is designed to take that impact and absorb that sort of impact without breaking. So it takes quite a shock load to break a wire in a fence these days. And yeah, as Jack was saying, a few animals passing through is not the end of the world, particularly if they're driven or in flight mode. But what you want is that ongoing day-to-day deterrent that an exclusion fence provides.
Yeah. There's a question here. You were talking about how it's kind of modernized the fencing, going away from barbed wire. Do you still think it's evolving, or do you reckon it's kind of the pinnacle now? And what do you see the future kind of trend with exclusion fencing?
Look, I think the electric fence spacing is evolving. I mean, the stuff that Jack's talked about tonight in terms of that monitoring stuff is really quite sophisticated now. The manufacturers of the wire continue to evolve, and in fact, a lot of the fencing now has strainer wires built into that mesh. No additional strainer wires are required, that sort of thing. And I think eventually there'll be, and Jack, you might know more about this than me, but there's a growing market for exclusion fencing, and I think there's probably a growing market for manufacturers to perhaps focus a little bit more on exclusion fencing. I'm not saying they don't, but there's some products around that have in the past been pretty expensive, like the deer mesh that I talked about. But I think manufacturers are looking, or should be looking at some of their products being used for exclusion fences, and it wouldn't take much to make them a little bit better and still affordable for exclusion fencing. So yeah, it is evolving, but we've also reached a point where if you were to build a traditional fence with some electrification, then the designs are well enough proven, I suppose, in these sanctuary environments, so we know what works and what doesn't work. So if you build to that standard, which is not difficult, then you're assured of pretty good results. Nothing is perfect and nothing is proof, but you know, you will exclude those pest species for sure.
Yeah, that sounds so. If you have so if a landholder wants to exclude some pests and wildlife off their property, would they normally go for a partial or like full exclusion? Does this come down to like the money and the cost of the fence, or?
Yeah, look, it does, and sorry, Jack, but cost is certainly an element, but I guess it depends on the wildlife population. So if you're trying to exclude foxes, not that many people would, but they're widespread through the landscape. So you would need to fence all sides. But if you've got, you know, wallabies or deer or something like that, that's more uses particular habitat types, i.e. bush or forest, then I guess you might have the opportunity to limit the amount of fencing you do. But you know, again, you know, Jack's talked about tonight some of those offsets and things. They'd be really handy for managing ferals and pest native species in a sort of connected landscape. So they might be good retrofits to existing fences when you might put other retrofits where there's more pressure on the fence. In other places, you know, for example, wombats are extremely difficult to manage in terms of fencing, extremely difficult, but they tend to stick to certain habitat types. And, you know, for us, they're up the back, they're not down the front. So we would have wombat fencing up the back if there's such a thing, and we wouldn't need that down the front. So it's a little bit of horses for courses, I suppose.
Yeah. Just with that question, Jack, does Gallagher have different products catered towards like full exclusion and partial?
Well, absolutely. So I guess in terms of that system that I showed there around the eye post, it comes in varying heights with varying numbers of holes in them. So you can add and utilize more or less wires depending on what you are looking to exclude or include. So for you know, the higher end of the exclusion, there's what we have as a 1650 high post, which you could have 10 wires with, you know, 5 hot wires on it to exclude the majority of your sort of animals out there. Obviously, small animals, the likes of rabbits and etc., are sort of things that are, like Jarrod mentioned, it's pretty challenging to completely eliminate. But then it comes down to the decision in terms of what pressures you are coming under from your local area, really.
Yeah. If no one has any other questions, I think we're about to wrap it up then. Yeah, we'd like to thank Jack and Jarrod for doing the presentation, and hope everyone learned something. And if they're looking at building a fence on their property, now they have a bit more information. So we'll send out a survey in the next couple of days. It'd be greatly appreciated if you fill it in. It helps us improve these webinars and any other ones we'll have in the future. So yeah, thank you, Jack, and thanks, Jarrod.
Thank you very much.
All right. Well, we'll end it there. All right. Thank you.